We moved forward yesterday on a clear support for businesses right across the country, but also very much the oil and gas industry here, with an accelerated capital cost allowance that will significantly help.
We know what matters to Canadians. They want to make sure that there are jobs for their families for today and for their children for tomorrow.
Liberals have again given $14 billion to corporations at a time when Canadians are struggling with many things.
Isn't it true that we've gone from the budget will balance itself to the budget will never balance itself at all?
After the plan comes the sell, and that's what the government was out doing today, trying to convince Canadians that going deeper into the red will ultimately be good for the economy. So do deficits even matter these days? Don't think so. And what to make about those tax credits for journalism. At Issue is here to dig into the fiscal update. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is here in Ottawa. Good to see everybody. So let's start with the overall message of the fiscal update, which did seem to be we're willing to go deeper into deficit in order to help Canadian businesses remain competitive with the United States. Chantal, is that a convincing argument for Canadians for going deeper into deficit?
Well, people most likely to point out that this is a really slippery path would be possibly the business community. And in this sense, you're not going to hear very much of that from them because they are the main beneficiaries. I've rarely seen a government double down on the deficit in good times with the Business Council, those would be big corporate guys, the small business lobby, and the Chamber of Commerce applauding with both hands. So up to a point, I can't talk to the economics or the wisdom of this, but it is certainly a wildly pre-election political document in the sense that it neutralizes the lobbies that would be most likely to say, wait a minute, these guys are not serious managers of public money.
True enough, but when I asked Morneau yesterday, Andrew, where is the concrete evidence that there is this flood of businesses leaving Canada for the United States, there didn't seem to be any real examples of this yet. And he admitted it was in large part preventative. So does that mean that it is a good thing?
Well, look, the reason we're in deficit isn't because there isn't enough revenues. If you go back to look at the last Harper budget, the revenues for this fiscal year are almost exactly on target with what the Harper government projected when they were projecting a small surplus. So the reason why we're running $18 billion, $19 billion deficits isn't because of a lack of revenues, it's because of the really rapid increase in spending that's been going on over the last 3 years. I think what a lot of people would have preferred to see than just this tinkering about with depreciation schedules would have been much more broad-ranging tax reform. You can bring down corporate tax rates and personal tax rates without the kind of revenue loss that we've seen in the States if you're prepared to broaden the tax base, if you're prepared to go out and eliminate a lot of these deductions and preferences that don't serve any useful purpose and in fact just distort investment decisions. A lot of people were calling for that. The government, for one reason or another, didn't want to go down that road. So instead what we get is something which doesn't really reduce tax rates, it just kind of moves them about a bit. If you can take profits earlier than you might otherwise, you pay less tax in the short run, you pay more tax in the long run. It probably helps at the margin, but it's not the kind of, it doesn't really begin to be a real answer to the kind of competitiveness challenge we're facing.
But it does force Althea companies to invest now if they want to take advantage of these things. And the hope is then, I guess, that if you invest now, you're not going to want to turn your back on it later.
No, that's true. And I think a few things. I think to Chantal's point, the business community was becoming basically the largest opponent that the Liberal government was facing going into the 2019 election. If we'll recall, last year, CFIB, this small business group, was really front and center when the Liberals tried to bring in those changes to the way private corporations were structured. Yeah. And they were calling in the days and weeks leading up to this fiscal update that they really wanted to see a plan. I mean, somewhat totally unrealistic, saying that they wanted like the budget to be balanced in 2 to 5 years. But now they're suddenly completely silent, even though we are, $14, $15 billion more into debt by giving corporations, whether they are small or large, big tax breaks. So I think they've neutralized in many ways an opponent that was going to come attack them from the right in the next campaign. I think they can't really afford actually to give more corporate tax cuts, like following the Donald Trump example from last year. Kevin Page was saying that that's $2 billion for every 1% drop yearly. That's a lot of money, and they're not actually proving to work in the U.S. So this, I think, was actually the advice that the Business Council of Canada was giving the government, and the government took it.
Okay, let me turn to the other element, because I want to hear you all weigh in on this, because it is in some ways much more controversial, even though it is a much smaller amount of money. It's, I think, about $600 million in tax breaks for journalism. The Conservatives are appalled that this has happened. Here's a little bit of what that sounded like today in question period.
What guarantee do we have that they will not use this slush fund as a gigantic propaganda machine for the Liberal Party?
We believe in a strong and independent free press. We know that our democracy relies on getting information to Canadians.
So this was obviously in response to a number of different media industries that have said, you know, we need some help, we need either subsidies or tax credits, what have you. Obviously, we're speaking on a public broadcaster where we receive an awful lot of money to do journalism. But with that caveat out there, Andrew, I know you have many thoughts on this. What did you make of the government's response and the timing of it? Because it has opened the door to attacks like the one we saw from the Conservatives.
Well, first of all, I'm glad to see the Conservatives opposing it. One of my worries was we'd see a bidding match between the two parties to see who could suck up to the media more. So it's actually fairly courageous.
That hasn't happened, yes.
Well, it's actually fairly courageous to see the Conservatives opposing this, because a lot of the media, a lot of people, both in the executive suite and on the pages of our newspapers, have wrapped their minds around the idea that, oh, maybe this is something we can justify. It's a really noticeable contrast to the response to the Kent Commission in 1980, when they recommended bringing in subsidies for news-gathering organizations. The nation's publishers, to their credit, rose up and said, we don't want any part of that. Now, obviously, we're in different times now, but some of those issues remain the same. And the issue is not, you know, Pierre Poilievre talking about, you know, a liberal slush fund for propaganda purposes. The issue is that well, first of all, if you're going to give out money like this, you can't give it to everybody who claims to be a news organization, because there's hundreds of thousands of them now. So you have to choose. Well, who's going to choose and on what basis? Well, we're going to have a panel of journalists doing it. And do we really think that that's going to be representative, if you will, of the range of opinions that actually exist out there? Or will a certain type of journalism and a certain type of very responsible, might be messages that you or I might agree with, but it's not going to be the kind of robust free exchange of ideas. It's going to be a particular type that will fit within that range. And not only will we have news organizations, trying to make sure they can fit within that ambit of who will get the tax credits, but you'll have journalists vying to be on that panel for all kinds of reasons I don't particularly want to speculate on. It's
okay,
just leading us down a really bad path.
Chantal's desperate to get in. Here we go.
Yes, only desperate up to a point, but since we are on the public broadcaster network, you can't compare it to the reaction or the situation at the time of the Kent Commission. And the fact that the executive suites and others in the media, French and English, just rushed to congratulate the government on this tells you all you need to know about how all those organizations are at wit's end to find a way to keep going. Yeah. The problem you would have with the Conservative reaction, beyond the fact that if they're going to spend the next election campaign saying every journalist that is covering them has been bought off, I'm not too sure that that's a winning strategy for very long, is do they have a solution, or do they want to live in a world that is totally dominated by the CBC and Radio-Canada? Because that is where this market is headed at this point. The counterpoint is that I don't believe this government help is a long-term solution. It's not a bridge to somewhere, because no one has found what that somewhere without government help would be. And the people who most dislike it, I think, except for the Conservatives, are people like us who cover politics and who are always unhappy to see governments try to find ways that will eventually give them more leverage, because while they may not buy us, I have never seen a party in power, Conservative, Parti Québécois, or Liberal, that did not want to use as much of the leverage as it could on the media.
Althea.
So a few different things there. I agree with Andrew about the panel. I think that's where really we're going to see whether or not this, like the usual suspects direct money towards a certain segment of the media, or whether or not this is really something that they want to help everybody flourish. I wear a bit of a different hat. I I used to run, a local not-for-profit, hyper-local blog. It's a registered not-for-profit. One of the things that the government has brought forward is the ability for not-for-profits like this to be able to issue charitable tax credits. Frankly, we're an entirely volunteer-run organization, and charitable credits might allow us to actually have like a reporter covering municipal affairs. And I think that would be a good thing. And that's maybe a model in small communities that people would like to embrace. Now, we are talking on a public broadcaster. Nobody from the Prime Minister's office told me what to say or not say on this panel.
Thank you
Nobody
for
ever
clarifying
does.
that for some people, yes.
Yeah,
Me
but you
either.
know what I mean? And
Yes.
so we're hearing some voices from the Conservative kind of suggest almost that there is like they need to bully us into doing our job fairly, and I think that's really destructive. So I'm not sure that this other part of the plan, this tax credit that helps pay our labor costs, is actually going to work. I share Chantal's suggestions that it's not a long-term strategy,
Yeah.
but I'm not really yet ready to say that this is a horrible and terrible idea, because I'm not sure what the solution is, and I really do think that especially in local and small communities across this country, the decline of journalism, local journalism, is a real problem. And
that's
I
what,
think
yes.
it does require some type of response.
And that's what they're trying to target. 30 seconds to you, Andrew.
Well, it's worse than not being a solution. It will retard us from making the kinds of changes that we're going to have to make as an industry. We've made every mistake in the book to get in this fix. This didn't just happen to us. And there's going to have to be major changes. We're going to need new players, new startups, et cetera. All this does is tell everybody in the business, especially the established players, you can go back to sleep. Uncle Government will be here to help you. And because it's not a solution, because it will actually retard the solution, the only most likelihood is there'll be more and more money to come in future years. You ain't seen nothing yet.
I hope not.
Okay.
And
on
I
that-
write for HuffPost, so.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.